I want to focus our attention here this afternoon on a book in the Bible that is perhaps not one that we go very often. It's not one you've probably heard a lot of sermons from, and yet there are some very, very important principles that are brought out in this particular book. Principles that relate very directly to the work of God, to the things that God would have us do. You know, we focused before, I think shortly before the conference, I had given a sermon, and focusing in the book of John, that Jesus said, "My Father works hitherto, and I work." God pictures Himself as working and as having a work. He's called us out to be a part of a work, the work of God, to have a part in doing that. God has called us as a first fruits. Now, there is a particular book in the Bible, the book of Nehemiah, that the whole theme of the book deals with the work of God in that day. Because down through time, down through the centuries of man's history, there has always been a work of God. Sometimes on a small scale, sometimes on a large scale. But we read the story in both the Old Testament and the New Testament. The specifics of what was involved have varied. But there has been a work of God. God has used individuals to accomplish His purpose. Now, when we pick up the story in the book of Nehemiah, remember there has been a background to this. If you remember, the Jews had gone into captivity. Nebuchadnezzar had burned and destroyed Jerusalem and taken the Jews into captivity as we read the story back in 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles and in the book of Daniel and other places. And they had gone to captivity in Babylon, and then after a period of about 70 years had gone by, Babylon itself fell. It wasn't quite 70 years, but that general time frame, about 65 years, I guess, actually. Babylon itself fell. The Persians came in. The story is told in the book of Daniel. The Persians came in, conquered Babylon. Now the Persians rule over that whole area. The Persian king Cyrus, a few years later, allowed the Jews to return under Zerubbabel, and they went back to Jerusalem, and they went back to rebuild the temple. When we pick up the story in the book of Nehemiah, we're picking up a story about 90 years after Zerubbabel had first gone back to rebuild the temple. What we find when we put the story together is the people went back and they were all excited, they were all charged up. They went back out of Babylon to rebuild the temple. They finally got it built. But their interest and their focus began to wane. Their focus began to sort of get diffused and sort of fuzzy. And so as time went by, people were focused on their own circumstances, their own situation, and the city of Jerusalem had never been rebuilt. The walls were still down, were just in decay as they had been destroyed. The gates were just charred rubble. And Jerusalem had not been destroyed, or had not been rebuilt. The people had become focused upon themselves and their own circumstances, and there was a lack of zeal or of commitment to really get anything accomplished. There was a little bit going on as we're going to read the story, but it was inconsequential, you know. There was one over here and one over there. This guy was stacking up a few bricks and that other one was doing a little bit, but it wasn't working together efficiently or effectively, and the city had remained waste, and this lengthy period of time had gone by. Now, as we open in the book of Nehemiah, Nehemiah sees a friend, and he inquired. It had been quite a while since he had talked to someone from Jerusalem, and he said, "How are things going back there? What's it like?" And he said, "Well, it's not going too well, and it's not, the whole place is still a mess. Nothing's ever really been done. And the walls are all broken down, and it's just, it's a disappointing mess." And Nehemiah was just really disturbed. This really upset him. He fasted and prayed. It was just very sad and dejected to realize that the city of God, the city of Jerusalem, the place that God had chosen and had set His name, that place was just lying in waste and that nobody seemed to be doing anything about it. So Nehemiah prayed, and we have here in Nehemiah chapter 1 and verse 5, he said, I beseech you, O Lord God of heaven, the great and terrible God that keeps covenant and mercy for them that love Him and observe His commandments. Let your ear now be attentive and your eyes open, that you may hear the prayer of your servant, which I pray before you now, day and night, for the children of Israel, your servants, and confess the sins of the children of Israel, which we have sinned against you. Both I and my father's house have sinned. We've dealt very corruptly against you. We've not kept the commandments, nor the statutes, nor the judgments which you commanded your servant Moses. Remember, I beseech you, the word that you commanded to Moses, prophesying of the fact that if the people transgressed, they would be scattered. But then, as he brings out in verse 9, if they were to turn back to God and begin to obey Him, that they would be regathered. And he says, verse 10, Now these are your servants and your people whom you've redeemed by your great power and by your strong hand. O Lord, I beseech you, let now your ear be attentive to the prayer of your servant and to the prayer of your servants who desire to fear your name and prosper. I pray you, your servant this day, and grant him mercy in the sight of this man. For I was the king's cupbearer. Now Nehemiah was convicted of the need to do something. We're going to see that, to begin with, there were two things that Nehemiah started out with. He had a clear focus. He was clearly focused on the work of God and what needed to be done, and he was a man of focus and he was a man of faith. Now we're going to see that there were other things involved, but that's a starting point. See, Nehemiah understood. He wasn't going to just be able to go and do all this stuff. Nehemiah was under no illusions of self-sufficiency. He knew that things were in a mess. He was focused on the need of what needed to be done. But he knew that if God didn't do it, it wasn't going to be accomplished. It wasn't going to work. How was he going to, just on his own, just go back and do it all? He was facing a very formidable obstacle because he was a cupbearer in the king's court. Now you think, well, what's that? The guy that does the dishes? No. That was a very important job because, you see, the Persians had a habit of poisoning one another. This was a problem, you see, and there's a lot of intrigue at the court, and they had all these problems. The cupbearer was one of the most valuable and trusted servants that the king had. He was the only guy that was trusted to bring the king his drink. He was the man that was trusted to see that the king didn't get poisoned, as maybe some of the king's predecessors had been. As the king maybe was wont to do to some of his enemies, he didn't want to get the same in return. So Nehemiah had a very trustworthy, very responsible position. He was the cupbearer. He was the one in charge of bringing the king his drink and of ensuring the king's security in that regard. And he knew that the king was not particularly interested in Jerusalem. Probably might not have even known exactly where to find it on the map. At least was not something that he was really concerned about. Nehemiah was focused on the need to do something. He was focused on the need for God's work to be finished and accomplished. He was focused on what had to be done, and he was a man of faith. He went to God. Now let's notice a couple of other things. As we come on chapter 2, this is the month Nisan. This is the first month of the sacred year, the month in which Passover occurs. And so Nehemiah fulfills his job. He brings wine to the king, gave it to the king. And the king noticed that Nehemiah was really sad. And he said, "What's wrong? You don't look sick, but something's wrong. Something's really eating on you. I've never seen you this way before." Now notice the end of verse 2. Then was I was very sore afraid. Now, the people that we're looking at in the Bible, they were people just like us. We find ourselves sometimes on the spot, and we're scared. You see, fear and faith sort of work at one another, work against one another. Nehemiah wanted to trust God. He knew that God was the one that it was the only way that the work was going to get done, the way that he was going to have special favor. But now that he was put on the spot and he was scared, because he was going to have to say something to the king, and he didn't know how the king was going to receive it. Haven't all of us been in situations like that? You confront something, you're on the mat, it may have involved your job, it may have involved something with the kids at school, may have involved something. All of a sudden, you're on the spot. You've prayed about it, you really asked God to, and now you're on the spot. And you don't know what's going to happen when you say it. Nehemiah was that way, and I think it's important for us to sort of realize that the people that we read about in the Bible weren't all Superman. They weren't someone that didn't have some of the same feelings and emotions and fears and worries and anxieties that all of us have. See, we're still us. God hasn't called a bunch of Supermen. Paul says in the New Testament, he says, we bear this treasure in earthen vessels. We've got heavenly treasure in earthen vessels. Vessels that are weak and fragile, and yet what we have is so precious that is within them. So, Nehemiah was confronted with a situation. He undoubtedly had been thinking about it and praying about it, and just almost sick in terms of what to do, how to approach it, and probably, there's background you and I don't know about. Maybe some others who had been there in the king's court had gone to the king and wanted some other appointment or some other job. Maybe somebody had gotten in trouble. The king was noted not to be a real even-tempered sort. And so we don't know, you see, all the specifics that had transpired, but Nehemiah was worried. And he said unto the king, he answered him. He said, King, you're right, I am sad. And there's a reason that the city of Jerusalem, my ancestral city, it lies waste, and the gates are consumed with fire. It's never been rebuilt. And the king said, well, what do you want? What do you want me to do about it? What's your request? So notice the end of verse 4. So I prayed to the God of heaven. Here's Nehemiah. He's standing there on the spot. The king has said, all right, well, that's the problem. What do you expect me to do about it? What do you want done? And Nehemiah, is grasping for groping for the right words. And he's, praying to God and says, God, please help me say it the right way. I don't want to make this guy mad. I don't want him to fly in a rage and chop my head off. I don't, all of the various things, you see. We don't know, but it's obvious from Nehemiah's attitude that this was not just a casual response. This was something that an awful lot was riding on. He didn't know how the king was going to react, except that God gave him favor. Sometimes we find ourselves in situations, I know I have, sometimes, and where, you're really filled with anxiety about something. You pray about it, and you pray about it, and you pray about it, and then all of a sudden you go in there and boom, it just sort of falls into place. And I remember years ago a situation that I got involved in, and I don't know if it was back in the 70s. I was down in Corpus at the time, and I got a call from Pasadena, and they had this. They had some sort of a program going. They were sending this fellow around. He was going to give lectures, and they were wanting some TV exposure, and they were wanting all this stuff. And they called me up and told me he was going to be there the following week, and they wanted TV coverage, and they wanted an article in the paper, and boom, that was the end of it. And I'll tell you, I hung up the phone. Well, I didn't know how to get all that stuff, and it was like here it was, and I remember really agonizing over it in terms of what I was going to do and how to go about it, and I didn't know exactly how to go about it, and I worked on getting something written up. I prayed about it, and I can remember even I couldn't get it out of my mind, what I was going to say, and you ever do that where you project out, you're going to say so and so, and then you just know what the other person's going to say, and you think of how you're going to come back to it, and you live the conversation in your mind 100 times. I mean, I can remember standing in the shower and just sort of going through the conversation, and they were going to say this, and what was I going to do, and all this whole thing. And so I finally worked myself up, prayed about it, went down there, and just was really loaded, was prepared for all of the defense I was going to have to give and the explanation and all this stuff. I brought it there, and the guy who was sitting there at the desk, he glanced over at it and said, "Yeah, that'll run tomorrow." Turned around and went back, doing whatever he was doing. I didn't have a chance to give him any of my spiel. It was like, boom, there it was. And then I walked out thinking, why was I in such a stew about all this thing? You ever do that? Why was I in such a stew about all this? Well, when you go through here, Nehemiah had a lot riding on it. He was in a stew. And after it was over with, he must have asked himself, why was I in such a stew about all that? He said to the king, he said, well, if verse 5, if it pleased the king, and if I found favor, if your servant has found favor in your sight, I want you to send me to Judah, unto the city of my father's sepulchres, that I may build it. And the king said, how long you want to be gone? Well, that probably wasn't a response he was expecting at all. He probably figured he was going to have to justify it and explain it and give this reason and that reason. The king said, how long are you going to be gone? So he told him, and so the king said, fine. And then he said, well, if it's, please the king, please give me letters to the governors beyond the river so that I can, travel there safely and they'll know that I'm really your representative. You find that what happened was the king appointed him governor of Judah. The king made him the governor of the whole area and sent him with a bunch of troops and said, fine, go to it. Be back when you said you would. Well, that wasn't what Nehemiah was expecting. You see, when God wants something done, He can open doors and He can do things, and He generally does it in ways you and I wouldn't have anticipated. Have you ever been real successful at second-guessing God? If you have, well, let me know, because I haven't been. My rate of second guessing God has just been fairly minimal. So Nehemiah sent all of this, and he came there, and when he came, there were problems. There were enemies of the work of God. In chapter 2, verse 10, Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the servant, the Ammonite. It grieved them exceedingly that there was come a man to seek the welfare of the children of Israel. That just ruined their whole day, because they didn't want to see Jerusalem rebuilt. They didn't want to see anything happen that was good for the Jews. So Sanballat was the leader of the Samaritans. And he was not a happy fellow when he heard that there was somebody back there. So Nehemiah came there to Jerusalem, and he didn't know who he could trust. Things were a mess. We're going to see how big a mess as we go on a little bit later, but things were a mess. So he got up in the middle of the night with a handful of men and began to go around and to check everything out, to check the wall, to check the gates, and to just go through all the things. So he did this. He would get up in the night, verse 15, and look at it, and then he would go back and return. Verse 16, the rulers knew not where I went or what I did. Neither had I as yet told it to the Jews, nor to the priests, nor to the nobles, nor to the rulers, nor to the rest that did the work. You see, there was something going on there, but it was not effective. They had been dribbling this thing on for years and hadn't gotten anything accomplished. This guy laid a couple of bricks, another guy came along, took them down, stuck a couple of bricks up over there. They were supposedly involved in getting something done, but nothing was getting accomplished. It was a muddle. It was a mess. I'm going to show you that as we come on through. So Nehemiah checked things out privately, saw the situation, didn't tell it to any of the ones that were involved in the work, just checked things out. And then, verse 17, then I said unto them, you see the distress that we're in, how Jerusalem lies waste, and the gates thereof are burned with fire. Come, let us build up the wall of Jerusalem, that we be no more a reproach. And then I told them of the hand of my God that was good upon me, and the king's words that he had spoken. And they said, let us arise up and build. They strengthened their hands for this good work. So Sanballat and Tobiah were upset about this, and they began making false accusations. Nehemiah told them in verse 20, the God of heaven will prosper us. We're His servants. We, His servants, will arise and build. You have no portion, nor right, nor memorial in Jerusalem. You guys get out of here. You don't have any connection with things. So here was Nehemiah. He was focused on what needed to be done. He had faith and confidence, and he trusted God, because in order for the work to go forward, to even start, there had to be someone who was clearly focused on what needed to be done, and someone who had faith and confidence, because without faith, then you start relying on yourself rather than God, and it's not too long before we found out how puny our human efforts are. So Nehemiah stirred the people, and he encouraged their faith by showing them how God had brought him there and had worked things out, so they were stirred up. Now, chapter 3, we come to the third key. Focus, faith. Here in chapter 3, we find organization. Nehemiah got things organized, because if it's going to be efficiently and effectively done, it's got to be organized. I don't care what it is. When we come on back through the story, we'll find in chapter 6, verse 15, the wall was finished in the 25th day of the month Elul in 52 days. They've been muddling on this thing for years, and you talk about somebody that was ready to. If you had a project you wanted done, Nehemiah would be the guy to put in charge of it. He was not a time waster. He lined them up, organized them, got things moving in 52 days. He had the wall finished. Now, that's incredible when you consider. But then it goes through and it tells the story of exactly how he did it. Now, we're not going to go through every detail, but just notice Nehemiah 3, verse 1. Eliashib, the high priest, rose up with his brethren, the priests. They builded the sheep gate, and they sanctified it and set up the doors, even unto the tower. And next to him, verse 2, built the men of Jericho. And next to them built Zaccur, the son of Imri. The fish gate, the sons of Hassenaah built. And they laid the beams thereof and set the doors and the locks and the bars and next to them. And so they just went around. Nehemiah got them organized, and he had everybody, where it all fit together. You see, they had been doing something. That's apparent. See, earlier, talked about those who were doing the work, but they hadn't accomplished anything. They were not organized in an efficient way. Nehemiah organized it out. He started with the high priest, and he got all of the priests together, and he was responsible for the sheep gate. That's where they brought the animals in that they were going to sacrifice at the temple. So he gave him that one, and they just worked around the wall. He delegated it out, organized the manpower. So he thoroughly organized things so it would work efficiently and effectively. People wouldn't be getting in each other's way. Some things wouldn't be, too many people trying to do, and other things nobody doing. So you can go through the story here in chapter 3, and it gives you the details. And if you were over in Jerusalem where you could walk around, you could actually see, each little section that was assigned to somebody. And so they had all these gates, from the sheep gate to the fish gate to the valley gate to the dung gate to the horse gate to the water gate to, all the various places around, and all the little sections of the wall, and it goes through the story. Well, chapter 4, then, Nehemiah gets them all organized out and gets things moving. When Sanballat heard we built the wall, he was wroth. Took great indignation, and he mocked the Jews. Wanted to discourage them, you see, and began to sort of put them down and make fun of them. And he and his army of Samaria, they said, "Wow, these feeble Jews, what are they going to do? They're going to. You guys think you're going to? You're going to get this thing finished in a day, huh? You think you're really organized now? Why? It's not going to amount to anything." And Tobiah, who was his buddy, see, in verse 3, he was the sort of the guy that was standing there. He was the cheerleader. Every time you read Sanballat, old Tobiah was standing over there. Yeah, you tell him, you get him. And so he said, he says, a fox could go through your little wall, knock over your wall. Why, it's nothing. So Nehemiah told him, Nehemiah just went to God about it. Verse 6, he was not discouraged, didn't lose his focus, didn't lose his faith. They kept moving on. Verse 6, so we built the wall. And all the wall was joined together unto the half thereof. The people had a mind to work. Okay, so they were focused on the job that needed to be done. It was a work of faith. It was organized. And now we find that there was a spirit of zeal and commitment to get it done. Got to have that too. So you can have all of the focus, and you can have all the faith, and you can have all the organization, and if you don't have a zeal to get out and do something, then it just doesn't a whole lot get done. So they went on. And in the meantime, there were problems going on. You see, the enemies kept trying to discourage them, to undermine it. They threatened. Verse 8, they conspired. Verse 9, we made our prayer to God and set a watch against them day and night. See, they sent rumors, and these guys are going to come in at night, and boy, they're going to tear this place up, and they're going to do this, and they're going to do that. All these threats, all this confusion. So not only was there focus and faith, not only was there organization and zeal, there was commitment. There was courage. There was courage. Because they were faced with obstacles, they were faced with threats, they were faced with all sorts of things. And so Nehemiah just said, well, we'll just keep watch, set a watch. And people began to get a little bit discouraged. Verse 10, Judah said, the strength of the bearers of burdens is decayed. There's much rubbish. We're not able to build the wall. Some of the people began to get discouraged and said there's too much work and all this stuff, and we're getting tired and we're worn out. And we've got all these adversaries that so Nehemiah looks at it and he does what he can. You know, verse 11, our adversary said, they shall not know, neither see, till we come into the midst among them and slay them and cause the work to cease. This is what the enemies were saying. Came to pass, when the Jews that dwelt by them came, they said unto us 10 times, from all places whence you shall return unto us, they will be upon you. Therefore I sat in the lower places behind the wall, and on the higher places I even set the people after their families with their swords and their spears and their bows. And I looked and rose up and said to the nobles and the rulers and to the rest of the people, don't be afraid of them. Remember the Lord, which is great and terrible, and fight for your brethren and your sons and your daughters and your wives and your houses. So it came to pass when our enemies heard that it was known unto us, and God had brought their counsel to naught, we returned all of us to the wall, every one to his work. It came to pass from this time forth that the half of my servants wrought in the work, and the other half of them held both the spears and the shields and the bows. And they built the wall, verse 17. They bore burdens and helped out, and they had the shovel in one hand or the hammer in one hand and the sword in the other. Verse 18, the builders, everyone had his sword girded by his side, and so builded. And he that sounded the trumpet was by me. I said unto the nobles and the rulers and the rest of the people, the work is great and large. We're separated upon the wall one from another. If that place thereof you hear the sound of the trumpet, resort you there unto us, our God shall fight for us. So again, Nehemiah was a highly organized individual, and he said, this place is spread out, and there's just a handful of us, and we're here, and here. And, these enemies come up and attack, so he was out there, and Nehemiah believed in communication. Sort of interesting. On various times when things would come up, he would call everybody together, and he would explain the situation. Now, they didn't have radios and walkie-talkies and television and telephones and all the things we had. But they had somebody that had a trumpet, had a shofar. It could be sounded, you could hear it all around. Nehemiah kept that fellow with him. And so he stayed where he could sort of keep an eye on things. And he said, now, if we have trouble in any one spot, we'll sound the shofar, and then people will gather to that spot. So he was focused in on how to utilize the resources he had efficiently. If you're not organized, I don't care in what endeavor in life, if you're not organized, you can't utilize your resources efficiently. That's what had been the case before Nehemiah got there. The resources were never utilized efficiently, and people got sidetracked. They didn't have the focus, they didn't have the faith, they didn't have the organization, and they didn't have the zeal, and they didn't get much done. So Nehemiah is faced with all these obstacles, with all of these things that are coming at him. And he is doing several things. He's keeping the people focused on why are we here? What's our purpose? He kept going to God, to fight his battles, going to God and asking God to intervene and to protect them. He didn't rely on these things, but this was a carnal people, and God allowed them to fight in that regard. But if you'll notice, as they were really seeking God, they didn't have to do that. God took care of it. But He organized them, and there was a zeal that was there. There was a courage that was there. So, verse 21, we labored in the work. Half of them held the spears from the rising of the morning till the stars appeared. This was not a union job. Nehemiah was running a hard job in that sense, from the time that they could see until the time the stars came out. That was the work day. And likewise, at the same time, I said unto the people, let every one with his servant lodge within Jerusalem in the night, that he may be a guard to us and labor on the day. Neither I, nor my brethren, nor my servants, nor the men of the guard which followed me, none of us put off our clothes, except that every man put them off for washing. He said, we even slept in our clothes. The only time we changed clothes was just to let them wash the dirty ones and put on some clean ones. So, Nehemiah was a very focused individual, and he was intent on getting the work finished and driving. You sort of get the idea that Nehemiah was sort of a hard driving type. He was a very focused person. He said, this thing is dragged on. It's dragged on for 90 years and nothing has gotten done. We need to get this thing finished. So he had that drive, that zeal, that determination. Now, there were problems. In the meantime, he had to deal with other things. Chapter 5, there was a great cry of the people and of their wives against their brethren, the Jews. Now, when you go back, if you want a section of Scripture to compare with this that was basically contemporary, you can go back to the book of Malachi. And you find that there were a lot of problems there, and a lot of the people, had not been tithing and different things. Well, there were problems, and as a result of there were physical problems and there were spiritual problems. They didn't have God's blessing. Economically, things were in a mess, and people were winding up borrowing money to pay their taxes and to eat. And some of the Jews that had a little money were loaning it to them and then charging them big interest rates, and just using it as an opportunity to take property. They'd take it as collateral, and then they would foreclose on it. Nehemiah was very upset. He was angry. Verse 6, when he heard about all this and heard how some people were taking advantage of one another, and he thought it over. He didn't have to call a great committee and spend all sorts of time. That was wrong. That's not right. And so he called them together, rebuked the nobles and the rulers, and said, "You exact usury, every one of his brother, and I set a great assembly against them." He said, "We're not going to allow this. We're not going to have this." And so the end of verse 8, they held their peace and found nothing to answer. They didn't have a good response. And Nehemiah said, "It's not good what you do. You need to walk in the fear of our God. God needs to be real to you people. If God were real to you, you wouldn't treat your neighbor that way, because you would realize that you are going to have to stand before the Creator of the universe. How dare you treat your neighbor that way and abuse him and take advantage of him, try to cheat him out of things? You need to fear God. You need to walk in the fear of our God because of the reproach of the nations. Don't you realize that we're dependent on God?" So he told them to leave this stuff alone and to restore what they had taken. And they agreed. Verse 12, Nehemiah was not the sort of guy you wanted to tangle with, to turn down. So he called the priests, verse 12, and took an oath of them that they would do according to the promise. And then he shook his lap, or his robe there, and said, "So God shake out every man from his house and from his labor that performs not this promise. Even thus he be shaken out and emptied." So Nehemiah made it very plain what they needed to do. And then he told them, pointed out that he did not take advantage of the people. He was there as the governor, and he could have used his position as the former governors before him. Verse 15, had been chargeable to the people and had taken bread and wine, and besides salary and the way that they had mistreated people, and how they had done. So Nehemiah was a very strong ruler, but Nehemiah never took advantage of people for personal gain. He wasn't in it for the money. He wasn't trying to get rich. He wasn't using his office to aggrandize himself and to oppress people. He was very focused. He was a very zealous and courageous individual. But Nehemiah set an outstanding example of one who was not in it for what he could get. Verse 16, yes, also I continued in the work of this wall. Neither bought we any land, and all my servants were gathered there unto the work. And then he talks about the people that were eating there at his table that he took care of, and how he tried to help and serve others. You know, and here were all these people trying to cheat one another and taking advantage. Well, chapter 6, when Sanballat and Tobiah heard about how the wall was builded up until there was no breach left. He had not yet set up the doors upon the gates, though. Sanballat called this group together and sent word to Nehemiah and said, "Come, let us meet together." This is chapter 6, verse 2. Let us meet together. But they thought to do me mischief. Nehemiah knew what they were up to, and he said, "I don't have time to fool with you." They sent 4 different times. Nehemiah told them in verse 3, he said, "I'm doing a great work. I can't come down. Why should the work cease while I leave it to come down to you? I don't have anything to talk with you people. I'm doing the work. There's a great work to be done. I don't have time to get off sidetracked and all this stuff." Well, they kept doing all these things, kept trying to stir up trouble and spread rumors and gossip, and were going to accuse him to the king that he was trying to lead a revolution. And all of these things. And he just went to God and asked him, as he says here in verse 9, he prayed to God. And he said, they all made us afraid, saying, "Their hands shall be weakened from the work, that it not be done. Therefore, O God, strengthen my hands." See, they were trying to stir up trouble and discourage the people and get the focus away from what needed to be done. Nehemiah went to God and he asked for the strength to carry it out, because they were trying to intimidate. And they did all sorts of things. They spread rumors and gossip and tried to get Nehemiah to flee, and they threatened him, and they did all these things. But we find, verse 15, the wall was finished in 52 days. That it came to pass, verse 16, when all our enemies heard, and all the nations that were round about us saw that there was much cast down. They saw these things, and they were much cast down in their own eyes, for they perceived that this work was wrought of our God. They began to realize this was the work of God. They had not been able to stop it. But, Tobiah and Sanballat kept stirring up trouble. In fact, verse 19, the end of the verse, Tobiah sent letters to put me in fear. He was going to intimidate Nehemiah, going to threaten him. Nehemiah was not the sort of guy you generally got very far with trying to threaten. Now, notice what we're going to see here. Satan hates whatever God, Satan hates whatever God's doing. And he's got basically two approaches to destroying the work here at the time of Nehemiah. One was attack from without, and the other was rot and decay from within. Now, as we're going to go on through, we will see that in addition to the clear focus that Nehemiah had, to the faith that he had, the organization that he brought about, the zeal that he displayed, the courage that he displayed, we find that there were two other key factors that brought about a part of the success of God's work being accomplished. And those were obedience, obedience to the law, obedience to God's law, and resisting assimilation with the world, resisting the loss of identity. Because you see, if they couldn't intimidate them from without, then they tried to entice them into relationships that would corrupt them from within. Now, what rode on this? Why was all this so important? Understand something. Satan desired to destroy the people of God. All the prophecies of the Old Testament pointed to the coming of the Messiah. That Christ was going to come, that He was going to be, that He was going to spring out of Judah. See, these are prophecies of the Old Testament, the Messiah. Satan did not want to see the Messiah come to redeem the world. He did not want to see that occur. So, right around this time, as we're coming toward the close of the Old Testament, God had The people had gone into captivity, but now God was delivering them from captivity. So when you read the book of Esther, you find that Satan had stirred up Haman, who in turn stirred up and sort of manipulated King Xerxes, who was the father of the king we're reading of here in Nehemiah, Artaxerxes. He stirred up Haman to get old Xerxes to sign a decree to kill all the Jews. So he was going to wipe out the Jewish nation by destroying them, by killing them. Well, you remember the story in Esther, and God worked that out and worked through circumstances and delivered His people, and they weren't destroyed. So now, here's the people of God having been regathered here to Jerusalem. The devil does not want the people of God to exist so that the Messiah, see, what does it say in John 1? He came unto His own received Him not. But all these things were prophesied. The devil was out to destroy that. So if you can't destroy the people of God by having them all killed, then destroy them from within where they're no longer the people of God. And so they were enticed into, in effect, losing their identity, just sort of mixing in with the nations around. And if that had been successful, the knowledge of the Hebrew language would have been lost. The preservation of the Bible would have ceased. There would simply have been no Jewish nation for Jesus Christ to have come to. There would have been no basis, no nation in existence that was the basis of the New Testament church. See, the devil was out to stop the plan of God. And so here were people who were being corrupted from within and enticed into assimilating with all these nations round about where their identity would have been lost. They would have simply just become part of the general milieu of the Middle East, and there would have been no Jewish nation. There would have been no Old Testament that would have been preserved. There would have been no knowledge of the way of God and the truth of God when Jesus Christ came. There wouldn't have even been a Jewish nation for Him to have been born into. So, Nehemiah, the story in the book of Nehemiah, is setting the stage for preserving the identity of the people of God so that when the New Testament opens, we pick up the story that there is in existence a people who have preserved the Bible, who preserved the Scriptures, who know and understand certain things, a group of people into which the Messiah is born, out of which the beginnings of the church is called, so that the truth can then go forth to all nations. It was not that the Jews were the totality of what God intended to deal with. But God had a plan and He had a purpose, and so the devil always looks for what can he do to muddy the waters and to destroy the plan and the purpose of God. So we find, as the story comes on, Nehemiah had to go through, and he called the people together here in chapter 7. And we find that in chapter 8 we have the story of the Ezra reading the law from there during the feast. And this is rehearsed in chapter 9, the history of the people. And in chapter 10, Nehemiah calls them together, and the people then at the end of this make a covenant. In verse 29, chapter 10, verse 29, to observe and do all the commandments. This is the last part of the verse. And not to resist assimilation with the nations around in verse 30. And then to bring the tithes and all of these things on down in 32 and 33. And talks about in 37, verse 37, that the tithes were brought there to the Levites. And so he organizes the city of Jerusalem, provides a suitable number of people to dwell there, and gives a little more story on some of the organization in chapter 12. And Nehemiah thinks that his job is done. He goes on back to Jerusalem. He goes on back to Persia. He has finished the work, right? Well, we find that there were problems. We find that there was a problem of corruption at the very top. The individual who was the high priest, who was the leader over the ministry of God, over the priesthood, An individual who had given every appearance of being very zealous in the work. If you go back to chapter 3, verse 1, he was the first guy out of the gate. He was there, boy. He wasn't going to let any of these outside enemies. This was Eliashib, the high priest. He got together the priests, and here they were going to build the wall. He's the first one mentioned there in Nehemiah 3:1. He was right there. Well, when we come on down through the story, chapter 13, that in verse 4, Eliashib the priest, having the oversight of the chamber of the house of our God, was allied unto Tobiah. He prepared for him a great chamber, the place where they used to store the meal offering and the frankincense and the vessels and the tithes. Now, can you imagine this? Now, in the temple, we think of just, the building to worship. Actually, the courtyard is where the people gathered for worship. The inside of the temple was the holy place and the Holy of Holies. But on three sides, on the sides and the back, there were 3 stories of apartments. These were rooms where, in some cases, priests lived while they were there in Jerusalem for the carrying out of the priestly functions. These were the offices that were used, kept, where the priest would go and change to officiate. All these things, there were all these rooms there. What do we find? We find that Eliashib, who was the high priest, who had given all this appearance of being so zealous for the work, we find while Nehemiah's out of town, this guy has sort of cozied up to the enemies of the work. And the next thing you know, old Tobiah, who was out stirring up trouble early on, who was an enemy of the work, Tobiah has moved into the temple. He's got an apartment up there. He's moved into the temple. Well, Nehemiah says in verse 6, chapter 13, verse 6, all this time I was not in Jerusalem. But in the 32nd year of Artaxerxes, king of Babylon, I came to the king. And then I asked permission to go back to Jerusalem. And I came to Jerusalem, verse 7, and I understood of the evil that Eliashib did for Tobiah in preparing him a chamber in the courts of the house of God, and it grieved me sore. Therefore I cast forth all the household stuff of Tobiah out of the chamber. And I commanded, and they cleansed the chamber. And I brought there again the vessels of the house of God. Now, you wouldn't want Nehemiah grieved sore, if you. He went up there, and he was outraged. I can't believe this. Next thing you know, here came beds and couches and coffee tables and lamps, all Tobiah's stuff, out of the window and onto the floor. He told all this household stuff, called in the bucket brigade to delouse the place and scrub it down. And he said, we're going to bring the holy things back in here. What is this guy doing here? And then he looked around and he noticed, where were the Levites? Well, they'd had to go and start farming. They'd had to go hunt jobs because people had quit tithing. And there wasn't anything there. Now, why had they done that? There was corruption at the very top. There was corruption. Eliashib, the high priest, had been an individual who was in cahoots with the enemies of the people of God. And of course, what happened? Well, people lost respect for him, lost respect for the priesthood, and they weren't, everything was in a mess. Verse 11, chapter 13, verse 11, Nehemiah says, I contended with the rulers, and I said, why is the house of God forsaken? And I gathered them together and I set them in their place. You better believe they knew that they were set by the time Nehemiah finished with them. All of Judah brought the tithe of the corn and the new wine and the oil into the treasuries. All of a sudden, Nehemiah came back and things began to hop. He began to clean house. He began to set things back on track. Can it remind you of anything, back a few years ago? Nehemiah began to set things back on track. And certain individuals who were faithful, he appointed, here in verse 13. And verse 15, in those days I saw some in Judah treading wine presses on the Sabbath, bringing in sheaves and loading up asses and wine and grapes and figs and all manner of burdens. They were bringing it into Jerusalem on the Sabbath day, setting up booths and, setting up shop and selling. And then verse 16, men of Tyre. They brought fish and all manner of ware, and they sold them on the Sabbath unto the children of Judah and in Jerusalem. Now remember, Nehemiah is the governor, so he's got police powers. He was not just out leading a revolution. He was appointed by the Persian king. God worked that out because there had been prophets back there preaching, and everybody had ignored it, and the devil kept stirring this thing up, and they needed a strong hand, somebody who would deal with the trouble at its source. So Nehemiah came back, and he was shocked, couldn't believe how quickly people had gotten off the track and begun to disregard the Sabbath, begun to ignore the law. You think the devil has changed tactics? You ever notice any consistency on the devil's part, that he always manages to do the same thing? He's either trying to stir up attacks from without or decay from within. He doesn't care. He doesn't care whether the house falls down because the wind blows and blows it down, or because the termites eat out all the the beams and the joists, and the whole thing falls down. Either way, you don't have a house anymore, do you? See, the devil doesn't care which way it's destroyed. He works one way and then he works the other. And of course the two, both serve to discourage God's people. When we're under constant bombardment from without, that can be a problem. When there's problems that come in a little more subtle way. Well, Nehemiah, it wasn't a subtle bone in his body. Nehemiah chapter 13, verse 17. I contended with the nobles of Judah, and I said unto them, what evil thing is this you do and profane the Sabbath? Didn't your fathers do the same thing? Didn't God bring all this evil upon us? Isn't that the reason we went into captivity to begin with? Are you going to bring more wrath by profaning the Sabbath? So it came to pass when the gates of Jerusalem began to be dark before the Sabbath. He didn't wait till the second of sundown. He said when the shadow begins to fall from the gates, and it's dark on the other side of the gates, when the shadow begins to fall, shut the gates. So I commanded the gates to be shut and charged them that they wouldn't open them again until after the Sabbath. And some of my servants I set at the gate, so there wouldn't be any burdens brought in. So, people having really understood the spirit of the law, we find, what did they do? The merchants and sellers of all kind of ware lodged outside of Jerusalem once or twice. Oh, can't come into the gates. Well, we just set up right outside the gate. So I testified against them, verse 21, and said, why are you lodging about the wall? If you do so again, I'm going to lay hands on you. He was not proposing to ordain any of them. From that time forth came they no more on the Sabbath. All of a sudden, they began to get the point that this was not a good thing. And he commanded the Levites to cleanse themselves and to come and keep the gates. Then he saw that the extent to which the Jews had intermarried with the wives of Ashdod and Ammon and Moab, and verse 24, why their children couldn't even speak the language. You see, here in danger of being assimilated, losing their identity in the world in which they live, just becoming so blended in with the society that within 2 or 3 generations they would have ceased to exist. Nobody would have even been around to really be able to read the inspired Scriptures, to have destroyed the people as they simply would have lost their identity. That's an attack that the people of God have always faced, is the loss of identity, being absorbed into the world to where you can't tell where the church starts and stops. You can't tell where the world stops and the church begins. Just sort of blend in. A loss of identity. Assimilation. We talked about that. I think I gave a sermon on Abraham and Lot and our role as strangers and pilgrims, as foreigners, as sojourners. You see, this has always been a test to the people of God. You can read of it in Genesis, you can read of it in Exodus, you can just go right on through. You can read of it in the Old Testament, read of it in the New Testament. The danger of the people of God losing their identity. Just becoming part of the world. So here we find this attitude of compromise, which was threatening the very continued existence of the people of God. It was threatening the identity of God's people, this spirit of compromise. So, Nehemiah laid down the law. And notice what he did. Here was the source of a lot of this problem. Verse 28. One of the sons of Joiada The son of Eliashib the high priest was son-in-law to Sanballat the Horonite. Therefore I chased him from me. I can just sort of visualize, this guy running out of the gate and down the road, and Nehemiah right in behind him. He got the point. He didn't show up again. But notice what this was. This was Eliashib's grandson. Eliashib was the high priest. He was the one, he seemed to be all zealous of the work. Way back in chapter 3. When you get on down the story, though, you find that he was one of the main ones that was bringing the world into the church. Here he gave this appearance of great zeal, but he had set up an apartment there for Tobiah. Now we find that his grandson, who was the heir to the priesthood. Now this is significant historically. Eliashib's grandson, who was the heir to the priesthood, was the son-in-law of the Samaritan ruler, the Samaritan governor. He was expelled. Now, when you come into the New Testament, you remember the story back in John chapter 4 when Christ encountered the woman at the well in Samaria? And she said to him, "Our fathers worship in this mountain, Mount Gerizim. You Jews say Jerusalem is the place." You remember? When Eliashib, or when this grandson, whose name was actually blotted out of the genealogy, see, his name isn't mentioned here. He was chased out. He went back to Samaria where his grandfather was. Josephus tells the story. Went back up there not where his grandfather was, where his father-in-law was. He went up to Samaria, and his father-in-law built him his own temple. Right on Mount Gerizim. And so now, the Samaritans in Mount Gerizim, they claim that, hey, our priesthood are the legitimate descendants. They're the ones that are descended from the high priest. We are the legitimate continuation of things. That was what they claimed. Because they could point to the fact that their priest was the one who was the heir of the priesthood. So they set up their own rival temple at Mount Gerizim. Christ, of course, made it very plain that salvation is of the Jews. As he told the woman at the well, he said, "You Samaritans worship you know not what. We know what we worship, for salvation is of the Jews." God preserved the identity of His people. He set the stage for the New Testament. But Nehemiah had to confront the problems at the very highest echelons. And he had to deal with that. And once he dealt with the problem at its source, things settled down. So, he made it plain, in verse 29, that they have defiled the priesthood and the covenant of the priesthood and of the Levites. Thus cleansed I them from all strangers and appointed the wards of the priests and the Levites, everyone to his business. So Nehemiah organized things. He was courageous enough to deal with the problems no matter where it went. He was not a respecter of persons. He was an individual of tremendous courage and drive. He had the focus, the clear focus on the job that needed to be done. He had the faith to be used of God to carry it out. He was an individual who recognized the importance of being organized and efficient. He was zealous and determined and inspired that quality in others. An individual of courage who would not be intimidated. He recognized the necessity of obedience to God and of keeping the commandments. He recognized the danger that lurked in the compromises that would lure the people of God into assimilation with the world. Brethren, these are lessons that we can learn from this book that God has preserved for us. The story that set the stage for the completion of God's dealing with the Old Testament church during the Old Testament period. And that set the stage for the story to which we're introduced when we open the New Testament. You can read the book of Malachi. It is a parallel. Ezra, Nehemiah, and Malachi were contemporaries. That's the last, in terms of chronology and time sequence, that's the last portions of the Old Testament that was written. Historically, Ezra and Nehemiah were responsible for the canon of the Old Testament as it was preserved by the Jews. God used a man of of extraordinary strength and courage and determination, a very highly motivated, zealous individual who was gifted in terms of organization and efficiency, but most of all was deeply committed to carrying out the job that was before him. There are a lot of lessons that we can learn, spiritual principles that we can glean, that as we look at the responsibility and the opportunity to which God has called us, lessons that we can learn from the book of Nehemiah.